All right. There we go. We didn't miss much. Okay. So here's a simple example. We have two countries and two goods, right? Obviously, this is, at some level, this is a very realistic example. But it gives us, I think, the key insights that we want to try to get. So let's say that the US worker, if they work an entire day, they can make 10 computers or they can make 100 shirts. And a Mexican worker can make 4 computers or 50 shirts. Okay, the US worker is more productive than the Mexican worker. Where does this productivity difference come from? We'll talk about that, right? We'll talk about that later. So what do we see? The US worker is more productive at producing both goods. We would say that the US worker has absolute advantage in producing both goods. The US worker has absolute advantage in producing both goods. And by absolute advantage, we just mean who can produce the most, right? Who can produce the most? But that's not what determines trade. Trade is determined by what we call comparative advantage. Meaning, who is the low opportunity cost producer of a good? Who is the low opportunity cost producer of a good? Now here we have a definition that has another phrase that needs a definition, and that's the phrase opportunity cost. What do we mean by opportunity cost? Anybody remember this from your readings?
You can hear us, right?
Exactly. It's what you give up to do something. Right? In some sense, an opportunity cost is the true cost of doing something. You know, so for instance, if I ask you, what's the opportunity cost of going to college? What would you tell me? What are some things that, right, everything you spend going to college?
It would only be what you don't make by working a job or doing something else with your time. It's not money you spend.
Right. So would tuition be an opportunity cost of going to college? Yeah, you would give up tuition, the money for tuition to go to college, right? How about your rent? No, you're going to pay that anyway. How about food? How about the money you could earn by getting a job? That's an opportunity cost, right? So it's what you give up to do something, right? So you're really not, you know, in some sense, your room and board is not a true opportunity cost of going to college. A true opportunity cost is your tuition, but also the money that you could be earning if you went out and got a job. Right now, for many of us, that might just be working at McDonald's. It may not be a lot of money, but it is a cost of going to college, right? You're giving up 4 years of essentially working. So that's what an opportunity cost is. And so what we're saying is that Trade isn't determined by who can produce the most. Okay, that's not what determines trade. What determines trade is who is the low opportunity cost producer of it. So in other words, we have to think about what each worker gives up when they decide to produce a good. Okay, and so let's think about this. Let's think about what the opportunity cost of a US computer is. And then think about what the opportunity cost of a US shirt is. And likewise, we can do this for Mexico. Each of these goods, for each of these countries, we can think about what the opportunity cost is. What you give up to make something. So let's go back here and look at our numbers. To make a computer, what does a US worker have to give up? $10 shirts, and right? In other words, to make 10 computers, you give up 100 shirts. So you're essentially giving up 10 shirts per computer. What's the opportunity cost? 10 shirts. It's what you give up relative to what you get. What you give up relative to what you get. Now, in this simple example, what's the opportunity cost of a US shirt? 1/10, right? It's just the inverse of that. Notice how we think of that opportunity cost here. What's the cost of a computer? How many shirts you give up. What's the cost of a shirt? How many computers you give up. All right? How about for Mexico? What's the opportunity cost of a Mexican computer? Well, they give up 50 shirts for 4 computers. So the opportunity cost is 50 divided by 4, or 12.5 shirts. That's the opportunity cost. They give up 12.5 shirts for every computer. And what's the opportunity cost of a Mexican shirt? Once again, it's just the inverse of that. 4 divided by 50, or what? 2 over 25. So what is that? 1 over 12.5. However you want to express it. Right? 1 over 12.5 computers. In this simple example where you only have 2 goods, yeah, they're just going to be the inverses of each other, right? Because there's really the cost of one in terms of the other is the inverse of the cost of the other in terms of the one. So now we figured out what the opportunity cost is, right? These are the opportunity costs. Now, who's the low opportunity cost producer of each of these goods? Who is the low opportunity cost producer of computers? The US, right? They only give up 10 computers, while Mexico gives up 12, I'm sorry, they only give up 10 shirts, while Mexico gives up 12.5 shirts, right? The US is the low opportunity cost producer of computers. What about shirts? Who's the low opportunity cost producer of shirts? Which one of these numbers is lower? Mexico, right? So, in this simple example, who should be making computers? The US. And who should be making shirts? Mexico. And then they trade with each other. Now you might say, wait a second, how does this work? Isn't the US more productive at producing everything? Yes. But once again, it's back to that question of LeBron mowing his lawn. Specialization is about specializing in what you are best at. So the US is better at making computers, they're better at making shirts. But where is their comparative advantage? Computers, right? The difference between the US and Mexico is bigger in terms of computers than it is in terms of shirts, right? The US makes twice as many shirts, they make 2.5 times as many computers. So that's where the comparative advantage comes from. Specializing in what you do best, right? Specializing in what you do best. And so, yeah, the US has comparative advantage in computers, and Mexico has comparative advantage in shirts. So what should they do? They should trade one for the other. In fact, we actually can say something about what is the price. At what price will it be mutually beneficial for both countries, I should put, to trade? What can we say about the price that shirts should trade for computers? Well, let's think about what should be the price of a computer. What price would make it beneficial for the US to sell a computer to Mexico? Well, not just 10 shirts, but anything greater than 10 shirts is good for them, right? So because it costs them 10 shirts to make it themselves, anything that they sell for more than 10 shirts is good. So any price greater than 10 shirts is good for the US. What about for Mexico? What price are they willing to buy shirts at? Or I'm sorry, what price are they willing to buy computers at? Well, it costs them 12.5 shirts to make it themselves. So what price is going to be good for them? Anything less than 12.5 shirts. So what can we say about the price? The price should be between the two opportunities. The price falling between those two opportunity costs makes it mutually beneficial for both countries. And that's what trade is, right? Trade is mutually beneficial. If it's not mutually beneficial, it's a must, right? So trade is when both parties say yes, right? And what can we say about the price? Any price that's between those two opportunity costs is going to be a good deal for both countries. They both can benefit from trade. And that's the key, right? LeBron James benefits from having somebody mow his lawn. Why? Because it gives him more time to spend on doing what he does best. Right? And so my guess is when you think about your life, you can think of any number of situations where you make similar decisions, right? You might even make similar decisions when you're thinking about a major, right? well, I like this. Maybe you're a really good student. Maybe you're good at, pretty much any subject you study. But one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, where is my comparative advantage, right? Where am I the best of the best, right? And that's really where the gains from trade come from, because by specializing in what's the best of the best, we get people who do the things that they're best at, right? We get people who do the things best. So have any of you guys, read the book Robinson Crusoe or heard of the book? No, you don't. No. This is an old book. It's written in the 1500s. It's basically about a guy that's stranded on a desert island all by himself, right? And he's a very sharp guy, right? A very smart guy. And so kind of the fun of the book is figuring out how this one guy by himself makes all this stuff, right? Maybe the analogy to Robinson Crusoe that many of you are more familiar with is, have you seen Gilligan's Island? Maybe you're too young even to see Gilligan's Island. Who's seen Gilligan's Island? Ah, you guys, you're killing me. You're making me feel so old. Gilligan's Island is a show from the 70s where, there's a boat that wrecks on an island and these misfits have to live on an island by themselves. And some of them are very clever. In fact, there's a professor who's on there and can make like radios out of coconuts and all this other stuff, right? He's very clever. But what's the problem? By having to do everything for yourself, you're not really particularly good at doing any one thing, right? And so that's the beauty of trade, right? The beauty of trade is it allows people to specialize in what they do best. One of the consequences of this is that, and one of the reasons why Gilligan's Island is kind of amusing, is it's amusing to think about some guy who can actually build a radio for himself, because honestly, there's not anybody in the world who knows how to build a radio from scratch. Not even a radio. I'll tell you that there's nobody in the world that knows how to make a pencil. And that's absolutely true. Because if you think about every aspect that goes into a pencil, whether it's collecting the rubber and making the rubber to make the eraser, whether it's mining the metal and getting the metal into that band, whether it's getting the carbon into that thing, there's nobody in the world that knows every little bit about making a pencil. But the beauty is, we don't have to, right? People have specialized in little aspects of what goes into making a pencil, and then we trade those goods for other goods. And what do we have at the end of it? A good that really nobody individually could ever make, right? That's really the benefits of specialization, right? Even something as simple as a pencil would be impossible without some degree of specialization, right? And so that's the gain from trade. And it's not just why individuals gain from trade, but it's why countries gain from trade, right? So even a country like the US, right, that has the power to produce a wide range of goods, still benefits from specialization, right? Still benefits from specialization. Because there's still things that there are people in other parts of the world that can make a little bit cheaper or maybe a little bit better. And by letting them do that, what does that then allow us to do? Focus on the things that we are best at, right? So we don't have to make everything. We can focus on the things that we are best at. So when we get to this country, or to the question, the first question on your syllabus yesterday, why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor? One of the arguments that I'm going to make is, and for those of you who've traveled, you'll see this. One of the big differences between rich countries and poor countries is the workers in rich countries are much more specialized than the workers in poor countries, right? Much more specialized, because specialization is one of the things that increases productivity and makes you rich. And so in some sense, that's why we're all in college, right? We all are expanding our minds, right? But we're all interested in specializing, right? Specializing and learning something that very few people can do. Why? Because that's appealing in an economy, because specialization is really where you get your productivity and you get your value, right? Now, having said this, right? And having said that this is the reason why, oops, Having talked that this is the reason why economists believe that free trade is good, right? This is the primary reason. It's not the only reason, right? In fact, we'll talk more a little bit later about other reasons why economists believe that free trade is good, but this is the primary reason why economists think that free trade is a good thing. It allows you to specialize in what you do best. It's, you know, as I mentioned a minute ago, I'm going to argue that it's right at the core of what makes rich countries rich and poor countries poor, is this ability to trade and specialize. But we also know, because I think I mentioned this yesterday, that if you ask the average American, is free trade a good thing? You'll see that there's very much a mixed opinion about free trade, right? That half of Americans, maybe a little bit less than half, but roughly about half of Americans believe that free trade does more harm than it does good. So why is free trade so unpopular? Well, I think we can actually see why it's unpopular, or why it can be unpopular, even in this simple example, okay? So look back to this example, right? Where we have the US has comparative advantage in computers, and Mexico has comparative advantage in shirts. So in our example, who wins? What kind of workers are going to be benefited the most by trade? Well, if we think about this from the US perspective, which workers are probably going to benefit the most by having trade with Mexico? Computer workers, right? Computer workers are going to win. Who else wins? Consumers, because now they get to buy cheaper shirts. But let's be clear. Consumers are going to benefit, but each consumer is only going to benefit a little bit, right? Now, instead of paying 12 shirts, right? Or, I'm sorry, instead of, it's like, what are our numbers? Instead of paying 1/10 of a shirt, US consumers are going to pay a little bit less than 1/10 of a shirt, okay? The shirts are going to be a little bit more cheap for them. Now, if you thought about an economy with thousands of goods, all those little bits add up, right, to a lot. But for any single good, the benefit to the consumer is little, right? So consumers benefit a little bit. Workers in computer industry, they benefit a lot. But are there some potential losers in this deal? Yeah, and who are the losers going to be? The people who make shirts. Shirt workers. And in this example, we kind of assume that those people who make shirts can just go and start making computers. But in reality, it may not be that simple, right? In fact, not may, it almost certainly is not that simple, right? So, in other words, the key here is that overall the country benefits from trade as a whole. But there are some losers. And those losers can lose a great deal. By that I mean, if you're a loser, you actually lose a lot. So there's lots of winners, but a lot of those winners only win a little bit. And then there's a small number of losers, or smaller number of losers, but those losers can potentially lose a great deal. So, for those of you who have taken the political science course, this might sound familiar, but in political science, we call this a special interest. These are the conditions under which special interest politics are likely to take the forefront. And what do I mean by special interest politics? When the winners of a policy, I should put that in here. When the winners of a policy are diffuse and the losers' costs are very concentrated, the losers have a large incentive to try to stop policy. Even a policy that is on the whole beneficial to the country. And so that is really right at the heart of why trade is unpopular. Is because most people don't see the small ways they benefit from trade. Most people don't see the fact that when they go to the grocery store, they're paying 6 cents less for a banana, or 20 cents less for a shirt, or $300 less for a car, right? Those things are relatively small. We don't see them. And if you added them all up, they would be big. But once again, they're diffuse, right? You just don't see them. Well, what about the shoe manufacturer in North Carolina? Or what about the coal worker in West Virginia? When they lose their job, they lose a lot. And because the costs are very concentrated, they have a big incentive to try to stop the policy through the political process, right? Another way you could think about this is they become one-issue voters, right? And that one issue is to stop trade, right? To stop trade. And so that is a lot of the reason why international trade is not popular, is because the costs are easy to see for some people, but the benefits aren't nearly as clear. Right? I think there's another thing that goes on, and that is there's a lot of political scapegoating. A lot of people want to blame trade for changes that would still be taking place in the economy. Okay. For instance, a lot of people blame trade for the decline in manufacturing jobs in the US, when it's not trade that's killing manufacturing jobs in the US. You know who's killing manufacturing jobs in the US? You guys are. You guys are. Why do I say you guys? Because what's true about your generation? you buy a lot less stuff and you spend more time on being online and other forms of entertainment that don't have a physical presence. So, in other words, you spend much more money on services than manufacturing. That's not because of China, that's because of you, right? And that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing when your preferences change and you want to buy other things. And so we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, but the decline in manufacturing has been precipitous in the US. But it's not because China's making all of our goods. I mean, it is a little bit of that. But by and large, the thing that's driving the decline in manufacturing is that most Americans don't buy as many manufactured goods as we used to, right? We're spending a lot more on services and a lot less on manufactured goods. And as I said, that's probably a very good thing. But it has fundamentally changed the economy. A lot of people, though, don't understand that, right? And it's a lot easier to say, well, China's stealing my job than it is to say that Amazon is stealing my job, right? Or Google, right? Or just the fact that I would prefer to go to a yoga class as opposed to have a second car, right? You know, that's just the way it is, right? So there's a lot of political scapegoating that goes on with this. So this is a topic we're going to keep on coming back to over and over again as well, right? Because it relates to those 6 big questions that we've talked about. But we've already kind of got an answer to that last question, right? I mean, why are economists such big fans of trade? Because we see it in the data that countries that trade more are richer. And why is that? Because it allows you to specialize. So there's no reason to think that a country that trades less is somehow going to do better, despite the fact that that is, you know, a belief of a lot of Americans. It's a belief that's decidedly wrong. Right? If you look at the data. So anyway, that's our little discussion about trade. And you know, as you'll see, this will be something that we keep on. I guess a theme of this class that we'll harp on numerous times is that, you know, there's a way that the world works, or there's the way that the world could work, which is the way that economists like to think about, and then there's the ways that the world does work, and that's how politics tend to think about things, right? And so there's a lot of interplay here between economics and politics, right? Thinking about the way that the world could work, we also have to think about the way that the world does work. And so, you know, in terms of international trade, I think one of the policy complaints that a lot of economists have is, why don't we aim our policy more at trying to compensate the losers from trade? Right? Trade would be more popular is if we focus on trying to help those people who lose from trade by trying to help them, for instance, retrain, or to give them wage supports or other things that would help to make sure that those who win share the benefits with those who lose. But we haven't done that. And once again, it's for complicated political reasons, right? So because of politics, we actually get kind of the worst of both worlds. We don't get trade, and we don't really compensate the losers, right? And so, yeah, it's frustrating. It's frustrating. Okay, so that's really it for comparative advantage, and that's really it for our kind of very brief microeconomic review. So anybody have any questions about this? So why don't we change gears here and maybe just for like a half an hour begin talking about chapter 7 on GDP. Okay, so in chapter 7, we're going to begin talking about macroeconomics, right? And basically, today, And tomorrow we're going to begin talking about some of the data of macroeconomics. So macroeconomics is an empirical science. And by that I mean we actually need to collect data about the world and make sure that our theories about how the world works actually matches up with what we observe happens in the real world. And so economists got to collect data. We have to collect data on variables that are of interest to us. And so two common things that we're interested in is income and inflation. GDP is our measure of aggregate income. And inflation is our measure of how the economy-wide price level changes over time. Okay? So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about both of these things, right? How income changes over time, how economists measure income and how it changes over time, and how economists measure the economy-wide price level and how that changes. So let's do GDP first. Okay, GDP is short for gross domestic product, right? A very intimidating word, but you know, honestly, as we're going to see, gross domestic product is a fairly simple idea, right? It really is a fairly simple idea. Now, here's something we need before we get into talking about how we measure GDP. It's important for us to understand that really GDP measures three things at once. It measures aggregate income, it measures aggregate output, it measures aggregate expenditure. Aggregate, of course, means total within an economy. Wait a second. How can you measure three things at once? How is it possible that one statistic can measure three things at once? Any ideas? Even in the equation, you can't measure three things at one time. Don't think too hard. Think real simple. How can you measure three things at once? If all three things are equal. And that's what's true for these things. These three things are all equal. Now, this seems a little confusing until you remember, we're talking about the entire economy, okay? We're talking about the entire economy. We're not talking about one individual. So, for one person, does one person's income have to equal their output, have to equal their spending? No, you guys are good examples of this, right? So most of you, what's your income? Close to zero. What's your output? Close to zero. What's your expenditure? High, right? So for you, your income is not the same as your output and your expenditure. How do you make that up? You borrow. But the only way you borrow is because what's true for somebody else. Their income and output are greater than their expenditure, right? Your borrowing is financed by somebody's savings. So for individuals, income could be different than output, and output could be different than spending. But what happens when we look at the entire economy? Resources have to come from somewhere, right? And so in other words, for the entire economy, total income has to equal total output has to equal total expenditure. If it all helps, once again, think about that desert island, right? If you put one person on a desert island, what's true about their income, their output, and expenditure? It's all the same. Now what happens if you put two people on the desert island? Now individually, their output and spending and income could be different, but together they have to add up. And so you add more and more people to that island, it's still going to be true that total income is equal to total output is equal to total expenditure. And so don't get confused by this, because sometimes you'll hear me talk about aggregate income, and then I'll talk about aggregate expenditure, and then I could talk about aggregate output, but I'm talking about the same thing. They're all measured by GDP. Okay? So in many ways, we're going to use these phrases interchangeably because they really are all measured by GDP. Right? The dollar value of these three things are all the same. So what's the definition? Of GDP? Well, this is a very long definition, a wordy definition, but once again, honestly, it's a pretty simple idea, despite the number of words. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a period of time. Okay, a lot of words. So let's just kind of work this one by one, go through this and talk about what is GDP. GDP is the market value. What do we mean by this? So when we measure GDP, we have to use market price to measure output. Okay? So let's say that we have an economy that made 200 cars and 10,000 oranges. Would it make sense to say the GDP is 10,000 people? That doesn't make a lick of sense, right? Because cars are a lot more valuable than oranges. How do we weigh each individual good? We weigh it by its market price. Okay? When it comes to measuring GDP, we not only have to figure out what goods are being produced, but we also have to look at the price of those goods. And so the government collects information on a whole range of products, but they also have to figure out what the prices of these things are sold at, right? So they go around the stores, they look on online stores, in-person stores, eBay, like they look at a wide range of places trying to get some idea about what market prices are. Goods and services. By this, we mean it's not just physical things that are counted, it's also services. Okay? So if you pay an Uber driver $4.50 to deliver your food, that goes into GDP, as well as the price of the food that you get. Okay? So it's both the goods and the services. right? It's both the goods and the services. And of course, what's happened here, just to do a little aside, but what's happened to the ratio of goods to services in the US economy? I think I mentioned this a minute ago. But look at this. Maybe a little bit hard for those of you that are in person to see. But this dark line is what's happening to services as a percent of spending. This is durable goods and non-durable goods. Okay, non-durable, as we're going to talk about, non-durable goods are goods that have less than a year's worth of value. So these are things like food, clothing, entertainment, expenses. Durables would be things like cars and washing machines. Look at the dramatic decline in durable goods, right? These are manufactured goods, right? We are just producing much fewer manufactured goods than we used to, and being replaced by services, right? So in GDP, we have to account for that, right? We have to account for that. So we include both goods and services. We skipped a word. Final. Okay. Final good. We only want to include the final good that is bought by the consumer. We don't want to include intermediate goods. Why? Because we don't want to count things twice. Okay? So if you think about a car, what gets included in GDP? The final value of the car, right? What that car is sold at off the lot. So do we want to include the value of the car and the value of the tires on that car? No, because the value of the tires should be reflected in the final price of the car. Now, you can see where this, though, can create a little bit of problem. Because what happens if I buy a new car, drive off the lot, hit a nail, blow a tire, go to the garage, and have them put a new tire on? Now, should that tire be included in GDP? Yes, because now that tire is a final good, right? So the same good in some circumstances is going to be intermediate. In other circumstances, it's going to be a final good, right? So, you know, hopefully the idea is simple. Calculating this in practice is a pain in the butt. But the idea is pretty simple, right? We just want to include final goods. So you can think about something as simple as gasoline, right? If I buy some gas to go on vacation, that's a final good. If I buy some gas to deliver a product for my firm, that's not a final good. Right? So, you know, as I said, complicated in practice, but hopefully the idea is simple, right? We only want to include final goods so we don't double count things. All right, of all these words, maybe the most important is produce, because that's really what GDP is focused on. Production. Something has to be produced. We do not want to include resale goods. Right? If I sell my house, should I include that in GDP? No, because my house was not produced. It already was produced, right? So when my house was built, it was included in GDP. But as the house gets sold over the years, you don't want to keep on counting it in GDP. And you can understand why, right? I mean, if you included resale goods, I could sell something to you, you sell it back to me, and we've increased GDP. But nothing's changed, right? So we don't want to include resale goods, right? Also, very importantly, we don't want to include any sort of transfer payments. And by transfer payments, basically meaning anything that involves me giving you money or you giving me money without anything being produced should not be included in GDP. So if your grandma sends you $5 for your birthday, not in GDP, right? Not in GDP. What happens when the government sends your grandma a Social Security check? Would that be included in GDP? No, nothing's been produced. What happens when you send the government your taxes? Nothing. What happens if the government sends you back a refund? Nothing, right? We also don't want to include in here any sort of financial transaction because once again, nothing is being produced. If I buy a share of GameStop, should that be included in GDP? No, because nothing's being produced. When I buy a share of stock, what am I doing? I'm giving the company money, and then they are giving me the promise of future dividends. Okay, but that's only a transfer, right? I'm giving them money now for hopefully money later. Nothing is actually being produced. So, absolutely the most important word in here for GDP is production. GDP focuses on production. And so just to give you an idea of the history of GDP, where does this come from? GDP was actually developed in the 1940s and 50s as a method of planning for World War II. And so really the government said, if we're going to fight this war, we need to know what we're producing. We better figure out a way to measure production. And so GDP focuses specifically on production, right? As we're going to talk about a little bit later, that's not the only measure of how well a country's doing. You could think of other measures of how well a country does. But GDP specifically focuses on production for good or for ill, as we'll talk about. There's some good things about that, but there's also some limitations of this. Okay? So produced. Next, within a country's borders. Within a country's borders. What does this mean? Nationality does not matter when it comes to GDP. Anything produced within US borders is included in US GDP. According to US GDP, who is the largest American automaker? Any guesses? Toyota. Toyota makes more cars in the US than any other company, right? Doesn't make any difference that they're a Japanese-owned company, right? If it's made in the US, it's counted in the US. We're going to talk later, but this creates, well, how should I say this? In some ways, this is because of convenience, right? It's easier to figure out where something is made than it is to figure out the nationality of a good. As we're going to see, most goods are decidedly international in flavor. So in some ways, this makes it simple, but in other ways, this really confuses things, right? For instance, most of you probably know that your iPhone is an import from China. How much of the value of your iPhone was actually contributed by China? About 3%. About 3% of the price of a cell phone actually comes from the production done in China. And yet it's counted as a Chinese export. Why? Because iPhones are finally assembled there. The last stage of production takes place in China before they're sent here to the US. Even though when you look at what goes to Apple, an American company, about 50% of the value of an iPhone goes to Apple, and yet we count it as an export or as an import, right? it doesn't make a lot of sense. That said, it is very, very, as we're going to talk about, it's very difficult to figure out the nationality of most goods nowadays because of global supply chains. Most goods are very international. So this is somewhat arbitrary, right? And as I said, you know, we'll kind of come back and talk about this, but this is a real problem with a lot of our measures in macroeconomics, because it's hard to say, well, that's from the US and that's from China and that's from Japan, right? It's just, in this increasingly globalized age, it's just really hard to do that. And then finally, over a period of time. So GDP is measured over a period of time, right? Usually a year, right? So you talk about GDP for 2020, GDP for 2019. That's typically how we talk about it. And GDP is often expressed as a growth rate. Where the growth rate of GDP is just the percentage change in GDP. So usually in the news, rarely will you actually hear people talk about the level of GDP, but they will say, well, GDP went up by 2.2%, right? Meaning that they calculated the percent change in GDP. So, you know, for instance, the growth rate of GDP between, oops. For instance, the growth rate of GDP between, sorry, God, I hate this when this, the growth rate of GDP between 2019 and 2020 would be the percent change in GDP. So it would be GDP in 1920 or 2020 minus GDP in 2019 divided by GDP in 2019 times 100, right? To express it as a percent. So this is how you often see GDP presented. We'll do some, this afternoon, we'll do some actual examples of calculating GDP, right? Where we'll talk about the level of GDP. We'll also express it as a growth rate, right? A percent change. Okay, well, you know what? That actually seems like a reasonable place to stop here. We'll come back this afternoon and talk a little bit more about GDP. I think we'll have a relatively short class this afternoon, maybe an hour or a little bit more than an hour, that we'll have entirely on Zoom. Okay, but we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about GDP and actually do some examples, right? Now that we've talked about, you know, how it kind of works in theory, we'll work through some numerical examples and make sure that we kind of get the gist of how GDP works, right? So that's where we will pick up this afternoon. So let's talk a little bit about the quiz. Specifically, do any of you have any questions about the quiz on supply and demand? So the quiz that we're going to take here in a couple minutes does not cover comparative advantage. It does not cover GDP. It's only on what we talked about yesterday, entirely on supply and demand. So anybody have any questions? So supply summarizes the actions of sellers, right? So you have to think about things that impact supply are really the things that are impacting the suppliers or the producers of a good. So you really have to think about, well, what impacts producers, right? And so we talked about some of those main things, such as technology or the price of inputs, the price of workers, or then just more sellers, right? If more sellers can get in the market, that's also going to impact the market supply. So when thinking about supply, you really have to think about it from the perspective of the producer. And then when you think about demand, you're really thinking about it from the perspective of the buyer, the purchaser, right? And so what are the things that tend to shift demand? Well, they're things that might impact people's desire to purchase it, such as, well, anything other than price, right? So income or taste or the price of complements, or the price of substitutes. Those are some of the things that we talked about. Who has some other questions? You want to work a problem or two just for practice? We got a little bit of time here. Hold on, let me see if I can find a problem at the end of our book. Okay. Given that some of this, who of us have a book here? So, in the interest of being socially distanced, I know don't get too close, but maybe you can pick the person you're at the table with and work on this problem together. Those of you who are online, I'll put you into a couple of breakout rooms, okay? But let's do this problem. Let's do problem number 3 at the end of chapter 3, okay? So let me read this to you. If you have a piece of paper, you can write down the question. Okay. So this question says the market for many goods changes in predictable ways according to the time of the year in response to events such as holidays or vacation times or seasonal changes in production, so on. So using supply and demand, explain the change in price in each of the following cases. Okay? So, part A. Lobster prices usually fall during the peak lobster harvest season, despite the fact that people like to eat lobster during the summer more than at any other time of the year. Okay? So why do lobster prices tend to fall in the summer, even though people tend to like to eat lobster in the summer? Okay. Second question. The prices of Christmas tree is lower after Christmas than before, but fewer trees are sold. Okay. C is the price of a round-trip ticket to Paris on Air France falls by more than $200 after the end of the school vacation in September. This happens despite the fact that generally worsening weather increases the cost of operating flights to Paris, and that Air France therefore reduces the number of flights to Paris at any given price during that time of year. These are kind of complicated questions, at least to read, but see what you can do with them for a couple of minutes, okay? And then we'll come back and talk about them all as a group. So let's give 5 minutes, and like I said, I'll put everybody online here into a couple of breakout rooms. No, wait in. Shh. You want to do part A up here on the board? You got it done?
Um,
Yeah. Do it now. And then we'll ridicule you if you get it wrong.
I'm thinking, no.
Anybody want to do B up here on the board? Minutes? How about C? Anybody feeling good about C? Atticus, you want to do C when they're done? Wait. Which one of you is Atticus? You guys look. With those masks, you look a lot alike. Atticus, you want to do C when you're okay?
I only got the,
Anybody want to fill in for Atticus, given he wasn't doing the problem? Ruthie? Try part C?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks. All right, so everyone, hopefully people are coming back here. I don't know if you're going to be able to see. Think about this. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you can kind of see this, right? Maybe. Okay, let me get my. Okay, these are kind of complicatedly worded questions. I'll try to, on questions I give you on your quiz or on your exam, try to make the wording a little bit clear so they're not open to so much discussion. But so part A, lobster prices usually fall during the summer peak lobster harvest, despite the fact that people like to eat lobster during the summer more than at any other time of the year. Okay, and so what was your thinking? That supply goes way up in the summer, right? But demand also goes up, but not nearly as much as supply, right? And so what happens to price? Price should go down, right? So you want to make sure that on these graphs always you want to label what's going on to price, and you probably also want to label what's going on to quantity, right? Just so you make sure that I know that you know what you're doing, right? That's always an important part of this, making sure I know that you know what you're doing. So yeah, right, I think here's a case where both supply and demand shift, but probably the change in supply is a lot bigger than the change in demand. And so while demand drives up price, the increase in supply greatly increases, or greatly decreases price. So yeah, that looks good. Oh, this one's gonna be harder. I should have given you guys a red pen. It's a little harder to see. But let me rewrite it. Up here using a black pen. And so B is the price of Christmas trees is lower after Christmas than before, but fewer trees are sold. And so the idea here is why does, first off, what's the market we're talking about? Market for Christmas trees. So do make that I think it's good practice to always write this down just so you're clear, I'm clear what the market is you're talking about. And so the idea is that demand would fall after Christmas. And so what happens to price? Price goes down. Quantity demanded falls as well. Or I'm sorry, quantity supplied falls as well. Right? So there's a reduction in quantity and there's a reduction in price. So fewer trees are sold after Christmas, despite the fact that the price went down. Why? Because there's obviously a fall in demand. That make sense? Okay, C. The price of a round-trip ticket to Paris on Air France falls by more than $200 after the end of school vacation. This happens despite the fact that generally worsening weather increases the costs of operating flights to Paris, and that Air France then, as a result, reduces it. So, Ruthie, you have supply going down a little bit because of the bad weather and the cutting in flights. But what's an even bigger fact is demand goes down after school break, right? And so where we began here, we end up there. So what happens to quantity? It goes down. What happens to price? It goes down, right? So that the decrease in demand outweighs the decline in supply. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And you did a good job here. Market for flights to Paris, right? That's the market, right? So that's, once again, that's a really good practice to get into. All right. Was that somewhat visible to all of you online? I hope it was a little bit. So, okay. Well, in the interest of time, I think we're just going to go ahead and take the quiz. So, before we do this, anybody have any questions? So, I'm going to give you all the paper copy to do here in a minute. Those of you who are online, I'm going to send you an email with a Word document. For questions that involve graphs, you can either just write very clearly what's happening in your graph, right, and what happens to price and quantity, or you can sketch your graph out on a piece of paper, take a picture of it, and put it in the Word document, okay? So this is a timed quiz. I'm going to give you all 20 minutes for it. So for those of you who are online, you need to send it back to me in 20 minutes, right? So from 20 minutes from whenever you receive it. So roughly about 10:50. I'll probably give you a couple of minutes extra leeway. And for those of us here, a little bit after 10:50, okay? All right. Remember, class at 12:30 this afternoon on Zoom, okay? Okay, sending quiz.